It's a controversial method that has been kept in the dark by state-run psychiatric hospitals in Washington. Spit hoods placed over patients' heads to restrain them against their will. An investigation by the Seattle Times brought attention to the practice, and the reporting is yielding change. We're joined by the reporter behind the investigation, Hannah Farfaro. Thank you for being here, Hannah.
Of course.
First off, can you explain what a spit hood is and why they can be dangerous?
A spit hood is a mesh or fabric bag. They've traditionally been used by police or sometimes in jails when transporting people who are under arrest or in prison. There are a lot of reasons why people in those situations might spit. More recently, these bags that are supposed to keep people who are in law enforcement or working in ambulances safe from infectious disease. We've started hearing more and more about them being used in medical settings, including the state psychiatric hospitals. And so the reporting looked at how they're being used and why.
And are there any mental impacts on patients who have been forced to be in these spitting hoods?
That's an interesting question. I think it's really hard to say. There's not a lot of research on the safety around spit hoods, whether or not they actually work at capturing spit. And certainly we don't know a lot about how patients are doing when they're being hooded. Some people who are hooded are experiencing psychosis, so they might not be fully aware of what they're experiencing. Through the course of my reporting, I have talked with some folks who've had that experience and have said it's really scary. Again, I think it kind of depends on the individual person, but we don't have a lot of research to back up anything at this point.
From your reporting, can you tell us who was making these calls to put the spit hoods on these patients? Was it a doctor, a nurse, administrator, or someone else? And has that changed since your reporting?
So our initial reporting, which we published in January, looked nationwide at how spit hoods are being used in medical settings. And so one of the findings from that initial report was that there are virtually no regulations around spit hoods. So inside an ambulance, an EMT might have a spit hood on hand, and they could make that decision to put a spit hood on a patient. In hospitals, it could be a nurse, it could be a physician. And so one of the big takeaways, I think, from the reporting so far is that who's making the decisions, we really don't know because there aren't regulations. Now, the state of Washington is going to regulate the use of spit hoods inside Western State Hospital, Eastern State Hospital, the state-run psychiatric facilities. So now, at least in those places, a doctor will have to sign off.
Any other regulation changes that you've noticed recently when it comes to the state as a whole?
Not the state as a whole. I will say when I was doing the reporting throughout the fall before we published, Harborview Medical Center decided to stop using spit hoods entirely. We've heard about a couple other examples in other settings where there are more regulations around spit hoods, but I think one of the things from the most recent story that I realized is that it's pretty uneven across the board. So an individual hospital might make that decision. A detention center could make that decision. But unless we had probably a state law or some sort of statewide regulation there, it's kind of, case by case at this point.
And Hannah, can you estimate how many patients in our state may have had a spit hood at some point, maybe in the last few years? Can you quantify this?
Unfortunately, we can't. There's not a lot of data. Hospitals aren't keeping track. Detention centers aren't keeping track. Police departments are one case where, at least in the state of Washington, there is an expectation that police are trained on how to use spit hoods, that they're logging that on their incident reports. But even that is not publicly available data that you can just go and look up online. So to answer your question, no, we really don't have a good sense of that.
Well, Hannah, thank you for your continued reporting. We'll definitely be keeping an eye out on the situation.
Thank you.